Hey everyone, I'm John Lynn, the founder and chief editor at Healthcare IT Today, and we're excited to bring you another in our series of interviews with top leaders in health IT. And today we're going to be talking about one of the most exciting things for me, which is AI in healthcare and learning about what's practical, what's really happening, cut through some of the noise, because I think everything's trying to adopt AI or at least say that they're AI. So hopefully we'll cut through some of that noise. And we have two guests today. We have Stead Burwell, he's co-founder and CEO, and Jonathan Wiggs, co-founder and CTO at Outbound AI. Welcome, guys.
Thank you.
John.
Good to be here, John.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, excited for this discussion. Like I said, this is a topic that I love. But before we dive into the topic today, Stead, maybe you could kick us off. Tell us a little bit about yourself and Outbound AI.
Sure. Yeah, it's exciting times to be in AI generally and AI for healthcare specifically. And I've got a 20-year background in guiding and running health tech companies. And a couple of years ago, a company I was running in the data analytics space was acquired by Providence Integria. And I had a chance to evaluate and look at where I wanted to go next. And I was really looking for a way to bring about exponential impact to healthcare delivery and healthcare providers, and got really deep in understanding natural language and deep learning progress. And I was approached by Madrona Venture Group, who thought that bringing together advancements in conversational AI technologies and applying it initially at healthcare's back office could really be an interesting place to build a transformational business, a great new company. And I was fortunate to be able to kind of spin out and create Outbound AI a couple of years ago, and the timing turned out to be pretty great. Not just because the technologies have been moving a lot over the last 2 to 3 years, obviously with the progress with large language models and revealed in the last 6 months, that's kind of a reflection of that. Mm-hmm. And so what we're building, or what we built at Outbound AI, is a sort of modern cloud platform that brings together some of the most advanced conversational AI technologies like speech recognition, natural language understanding, and natural language generation, and speech synthesis, and bring it in a way that our company can help build, train, and deploy operationally powerful AI virtual agents that can take on a lot of the rote, routine administrative tasks today that really burden and cause tremendous amount of suffering for healthcare workers today.
Yeah. Well, and your timing is perfect for that, because there's a lot of that suffering happening in healthcare today with, the workforce challenges, et cetera. So that's great. We're going to dive into that. Jonathan, how about you give us a little bit about yourself as well?
Yeah, I mean, I've been in the Seattle area since, the early 90s, done about half a dozen startups in the area, largely in the ML and AI space. I was was the first employee and one of the co-founders of a company called Jot back in the early aughts, which was one of the very first kind of voice assistant companies. Acquired by Nuance, ended up at Nuance for several years, and in the research side, running speech modeling teams, engaged on the Siri launch for Apple at that point. So it's been a long kind of fun career in this space. And I sort of took a deviation from that over the last 7 years before joining Outbound at a company called Avalara here in Seattle, which was a fintech tax service that IPO'd. So I was 4 years pre-IPO, 3 years post-IPO as the VP of engineering for core platform and architecture. So it was a fun ride, but I was starting to look around for something to get back into the creative side of things. And Outbound came up and ended up talking to Madrona instead, and it seemed like a great fit, and was super excited to engage, and here I am.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I mean, Jonathan, you've seen this evolution, right? Like of how AI can benefit us. And in many ways, we've lived it. But what do you see as kind of the workforce benefit? Stead talked about some of the challenges healthcare organizations faced with all this mundane tasks. What do you see as the workforce benefits of AI when implemented properly? And I say that
Yeah.
significantly because there's a lot of poor implementations, or it's not even AI, it's, RPA or anyway,
Right.
go ahead. I'd
Yeah.
love to hear.
It's rules based, right? Which is completely the antithesis of what we're doing and what we're trying to accomplish from a technical perspective. I mean, it's a great question. I think, one of our core philosophies is really around human agent teaming. And to me, what that really encapsulates is, using both, highly skilled knowledge workers and leveraging AI for what they're both good at, not trying to replace one or the other with what they're bad at. I think it's very appealing for a lot of companies to try to come out of the gate with a solution and claim that it's going to do everything end to end, and ignore the fact that, like anything else, it does some things really well, it does some things less well. And so we really want to use those strengths of both sides to produce a solution and operationalize a solution that's actually going to fit the need. And that operational aspect, as you very rightly call out, is a huge component that I think even I think specifically large technology companies have a tendency to overlook because of who they are. So IBM is kind of a great example of that in the healthcare space, especially, right? So.
Oh, that's really interesting hearing you talk about teaming, right? Because that is a nice way to think about it, right? As your AI agent is on the team that you're part of, right? Doing what there's best. I love that approach. Stead, what would you add as kind of the workforce benefits? And maybe let's expand the discussion a little too, and kind of talk about how healthcare organizations should measure whether the AI is worth implementing. Like, how should they look at it from, an ROI perspective or even an evaluation perspective?
Yeah, so back to kind of the original premise of the company, we were talking about exponential tech. And the pain point is pervasively the challenges that healthcare workers are facing. So we've set about to bring real world AI to the industry. And so absolutely there's a role for data science type of AI, machine learning to come in to insights and triggers that may change clinical decisions and pathways that are based on big data and analytics. And that's AI, if you will, that's impactful. We're bringing real world AI, which is a sort of an ability to train and operationalize virtual agents who can speak and understand human language. And that to us is transformational. So what that means is, and if it kind of high level ROI is, we're able to take on tasks that humans are doing today that tends to revolve around rote routine analysis, oftentimes around data, and communication back and forth around more complex transactions related to data. And that's pervasive in healthcare because, as you can imagine, a lot of encounters, a lot of transactions are data rich and complex. So somewhere between 20 to 40% of encounters or transactions tend to be complex, highly personalized, need narratives or conversations around it. And because of that, transactions don't easily adjudicate through EDI, or it makes it easy to build RESTful APIs that are going to exchange data so elegantly that the whole industry is banking on that RESTful APIs are going to solve the problem. We actually think for complex transactions, of which there's just a ton in healthcare, a language-based model of communicating and negotiating the exchange of information will be far more scalable and successful over time. And so the ROI here is the virtual agents that are AI powered will be able to do the work that humans are doing today at 50 to 80% the cost that they're doing today on data that is already out on the edge. So like the biggest pain point for health tech over the last 5-7 years is that we've been going back to IT, and we've been asking for more data in order to justify the value prop of our new features or our more advanced analytic applications. And IT is just jammed, and the EMRs are like, that's vulnerability and issues to extending more complex data out to the edge. The cool thing about bringing real world AI is we work on data that's been out there that humans have been working on for 20 years. And so the time to value is day one. The impact is right away with the straight dollar for dollar savings of it's 50% to 80% off the cost of human workers doing these tasks. And there's exponential benefit, and essentially you're removing the worst tasks of these workers' day, and you're taking it on with novel, compelling technology. So that's amazing. Like, the ROI is a slam dunk. The challenge is not so much the ROI. The challenge is building software and engagements with the virtual agents and the technology that elicits trust and security and comfort and visibility among supervisors and managers and the executive teams. And so we're going to go through this journey of tackling on more and more tasks and a greater percentage of the routine work that healthcare workers do, and penetrate over time more and more functions. And kind of that's the beginning of the journey that we are as an industry. And I think we'll see it, over the next 20 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting when you think about, like, this, to me, I've described it as essential, right? Like, we can't hire enough people. And so we have to do these types of things. And the people that we're retaining, if we don't do some of these solutions, we're going to burn them out and they're going to be gone too. Right. So, like, it's a beautiful, thing when implemented right. But let's get into some practical. Yeah, go ahead, Sid.
Let me just say to that, when we looked at this, I mean, we all know that the existential issue is what's going to happen when AIs take all of our jobs. And the wonderful thing about healthcare is there's 2.7 million jobs in healthcare that are not being filled today. And that's just increasing. And we all know that each year, more and more 65-year-olds from the boomer generation are stacking into this cohort that will be utilizing 5x the health system than they do today. So we have this tsunami of demand facing the industry. And so everybody employed in healthcare today really needs to serve 2 to 3x the volume at new novel approaches, more holistic approaches to care delivery. And so this industry needs AI in just a compelling way. And we don't face many of the issues of losing jobs that you'll see might possibly see in other industries.
Yeah, we've talked about this on the podcast before. Instead of saying, is it going to take my job? They say, please come in. I'm doing 3 jobs. That's the reality. But Jonathan, let's dive into some of the practical things, right? Because it's great to talk about theoretically AI can come in and help me be more efficient and take the mundane away. Maybe start with billing, because that's where Outbound AI started, right? Like, where is AI effective at doing things, and where is it maybe not effective and still needs the human touch?
Yeah. I mean, it's a good question. I mean, where AI is really effective, especially for us, and where we focused a lot of our early work on the tech side, is tasks and use cases that have very specific language utilization. So what we would think of as a fairly narrow idiolect. Very common or broader tasks, might have a lot of language variation. But so much of what these folks are doing, like when they call into a provider, and want to get an explanation of benefits. If you listen to 1,000 of those calls, there's almost no variation in the language used, right? So you've got these very, very specific word utilization, pattern utilization. So those lend themselves really well to a conversational AI approach. And we've really leveraged that. So, our tech can call in, listen to IVRs, respond to IVRs, ignore the PSAs, deal with variation in those, they're not at all rules based, so they're quite flexible. Get to an agent, so we're really able to leverage a lot of that. Where I think AI tends to be, I don't want to say misunderstood, but where I think people seem to think that it's going to clip in sooner rather than later are areas where a lot of contextual information is required. And you see this even in utilization with, systems like ChatGPT and GPT-3, right? That, what we might refer to as conversational implicature, right? So, what is the social and the business framing around the conversation that you're having that drives your understanding of the language being used? And in a lot of cases, AI is not going to get that, right? AI is not actually on the floor with people, understanding what's going on, having those side conversations, understanding the social context, knowing how language is evolving on a day-to-day basis, which it does. So it doesn't have that same level of context. It's very good at patterns. It's very good at understanding large amounts and processing large amounts of data. But that context, which for a knowledge worker, we might think of as their, experience and their business acumen coming into play, right? So again, that's where we go back to the strengths of kind of both sides and how you bring those together to leverage it so that you can actually operationalize a solution that works.
And we do that by focusing on an industry and focusing on functions within the industry, that being healthcare, that being rev cycle, and then in fact roles within those functions. And it's a reorientation of thinking about the workforce. And if you think about it, what are those tasks that AI agents can take on to allow them to, and everybody in healthcare always talks about top of the licensing impact, but truly taking off the rote routine and activities that virtual agents like doing or machines like doing more than humans do, and allow humans to focus on what they're exceptional at, which tends to be more strategic, more complex opportunities and tasks. And so our business and our value prop to the industry, both to the healthcare industry and to the generalized AI industry, is we're closer to that enterprise customer, and we're building the innovation and the framing and the context models, both in software and data transformation, that allows us to work really effectively with the generalized base AI services. And John, coming from Avalara, he understands what it's like to build a verticalized, scalable content system that empowers a mission critical engine for what was the global e-commerce infrastructure.
Yeah, and Jonathan, that was what I was going to ask about. You've mentioned it now a couple times, that the difference between like a rules-based system versus true AI. Help us understand how that is in actual implementation, because I think people understand some rules based, like, oh, I've been through this, it's a rote process, I should just apply some rules and do it.
Right.
But help us understand the difference between how you're approaching it versus just a simple rules engine, if you will.
Yeah, well, I mean, a rules engine, think of RPA, right? So, looking for a very specific input and responding with a very specific output. That really is kind of the essence of a rules-based system, right? It's a structure of rules that looks for a specific A and responds with a specific B.
And falls apart when it gets C.
Right, yeah, exactly. And any variation on that input breaks it completely. And so it has
oftentimes the order of those rules. The order becomes significant too.
Absolutely. But that kind of puts you into this position where you have and I think a lot of, the companies we've talked to that are using RPA have run into this very directly. That creates a huge maintenance burden, right? Where you've got to constantly be going in and updating because these systems are changing on a weekly basis in many cases.
Finding the exceptions and putting in new rules.
That's right. So what we've really focused on is understanding the intent. So whether it's an IVR or a human or whatever the case may be, when somebody speaks to our system, we're analyzing the intent. So we're using statistical models and neural networks to be able to understand, what did they actually mean? What are they really asking for? To be able to interpret that, and then understanding how we should structure a response for that. So it's quite dynamic. And we're able to leverage that in a way that allows us to handle variation. So, a great example, if we're talking to an IVR and they make a change or they add new PSAs, which they do all the time, it doesn't bother us at all. We can handle that without a problem. And what that allows us to do is, as we continue to analyze payers and add support for payer infrastructure into our automations and into our virtual agent support, we almost never need to go back and make adjustments. So I think we've done that once in the last year and a half for one payer, because they made a rather dramatic change that used new language, and we had to go back and spend a couple of days touching that. But otherwise, once we add payer support for automations, it's pretty much out of the box for our customers. And that's also a very different aspect than the rules-based system. So when a company gets RPA or a rules-based system, they've got to go through the training process. And in many cases, that can take months. Any payer we support, any automation we support, it's out of the box. You can use us in those automations day one for your business. So
interesting. How do you build that trust, though? I mean, Stead talked about that's that's one of the challenges, that they're like, is this true? Like, how do you do that with a customer to for them to believe that, hey, out of the box, this works?
Yeah. So we go through a proof of concept process typically with new customers coming in. The nice thing is, if you look at, for instance, a rev cycle call center, those agents are already operating on a set of data that they need to conduct their business day to day. Well, as Stead pointed out, that's the same data we use. So they can literally take that claims data, drop it to us, once we've got a BAA and a contract in place for that proof of concept, and we can turn around automated results for those claims same day, and start to feed them data back. So it's very, very quick for us to be able to be demonstrative about what we're doing. Again, instead of kind of going through this dance at the very beginning where we're trying to prove value, we're trying to train, we're trying to get data, and which is super complex and can be really frustrating for a customer. This really gets us to fast results, fast demonstrative value out of the gate.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Like, there's multi-layers of establishing that trust, especially for an earlier company in the early part of this industry. So I think it's multi-layer. Obviously, John and our company is built on sort of mission critical cloud infrastructure, and John's built that before in the past. Our platform SOC 2, we're industry focused alone, right? So that's there's generalized chatbot vendors that cover multi-industries. We're radically focused on a mission on elevating the human work experience in healthcare. And we do that through AI-based assistance to healthcare workers. And so it's a multi-layered dimension that starts in the technology and the security, but it's also our kind of value prop out of the gate and kind of how we bring this to our customers and our focus and our understanding of their needs and the opportunity there.
Yeah. Well, to that point, you've focused on billing as an initial effort, which just makes sense for these types of solutions. What are some of the clinical applications you're working on, or where are you headed when it comes to the clinical side of things as well? Or is just billing where it's at? Instead, maybe you can share.
Well, what's interesting, so there's some great pioneers and players in the billing, in the clinical space.
Mm-hmm.
And Nuance, where John worked previously, is a great example of a company that's done amazing things and innovating and bringing about early conversational AI technologies for doctor dictation of clinical notes. And now Secara and Nuance moving forward, DAX for ambient clinical intelligence around those clinical encounters. The whole industry is almost built up around shielding and kind of filtering through that 15-minute encounter. Mm-hmm. And then there's a whole set of processes and services post-encounter.
Yeah.
that whole area ends up impacting the clinicians too, whether it be kind of more traditional notions of a nurse practitioner, physician's assistant, physician, let's say. But there's study after study that speaks to all of the administrative functions that that nurses do and even doctors do, particularly in smaller practice, let's say. And so we're focused on administrative functions and how they impact the various roles and functions throughout healthcare. And so there are admin functions on the providers, the doctor side, but the clinical side is, there's great players focusing on that. I think it's a pretty obvious and it's a pretty well-trodden spot. And I think where there's a massive amount of savings and impact to be had is pre and post those encounters and how those admin functions impact various different groups. And it can bleed into those clinical professions.
Sure. Well, the doctors want to get paid, and they've been pushed a lot of administrative work because we want the data so badly. So it's interesting how that's impacted them in negative ways. So we'll see how it evolves. Jonathan, what do you kind of see happening as you kind of look forward with conversational AI? Obviously, ChatGPT opened a lot of our eyes. I think that's what I would describe what it did, is that it opened our eyes that we're closer than we thought, like, to some of these things. But, what do you see happening with conversational AI in healthcare specifically? And maybe how are some people misunderstanding it and what it could do and what it should or shouldn't do in healthcare?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. ChatGPT and GPT-3 specifically, I think a lot of people are having the tendency to anthropomorphize the responses coming out of systems like that, because what they really are is they're pattern-based systems, right? So it's understanding a pattern of data coming in, and it's responding with a commonly used patterned response.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't cognitive in any way. It's not actually conversational from that perspective. It doesn't necessarily understand that context. I mean, I'll give you a great example. If you ask GPT-3 to give you a random number between 1 and 100, there are only 2 numbers it will respond with every time, no matter how many times you ask. And if you ask it to give you a random number that isn't one of those 2, between 1 and 100, it'll give you a negative number. So it starts to fall outside of where its training is, where its high value statistical modeling is placed in. So I think a lot of people are kind of attributing cognitive properties to what it's doing, which absolutely is not the case. It definitely has some amazing superpowers, and those are really evident if you've spent any time working through it. But how that will affect conversational AI, it's very good at helping you understand intent. It's very good at helping you structure human-like responses to queries, but it isn't a solution in and of itself, right? And I think that's where a lot of people are going to be unhappily surprised in thinking that something like this is going to step in and just solve a bunch of problems. It won't. It'll be a great tool. It's definitely another superpowered tool in the toolbox, but it still requires all of these other ML and AI applications to be able to function as part of a conversational stack. You've still got to be able to understand language and transcribe it and break language down into its component parts, and structure context and be able to respond. So, I think what you're going to see is kind of especially in healthcare, is a spike in interest and everybody kind of clamoring to try to find solutions in this space because they want to get ahead of the game. They want this to solve the problems that they have. Then you'll see a little bit of a retraction as people actually start to understand, oh, wait, there's some hyperbole going on.
These are the
here,
limitations.
Right?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, precisely. That can make it challenging to operationalize and implement a solution like this. And then you'll start to see applications that are leveraging it smartly as part of a stack really take off because it gives them additional powers and strengths. So you'll start to kind of get some better to signal to noise ratio as that hyperbole starts to bleed off. So I think you're going to see that kind of upswell dip and then momentum start to build typically.
It's a little bit 2 steps forward, 1 step back, I think.
Yep.
And we think it's still, it's like John said, it's kind of aligned with how we've been thinking about it. Is there's tremendous opportunity to operationalize these advancements in conversational AI technologies closer to the edge. And the capability or superpower around summarization has turned out to be very interesting to us.
Yep.
And we've always come at this thinking that the translation from unstructured language and narrative to structured language, so the ability to communicate and understand human language and through software translate that to machine language like SQL, is like a super valuable function of benefit to what we do. What we didn't realize was, while doing that, how important it is to actually summarize that activity too. And so it turns out the summarization capability as a superpower probably is going to add material value to our overall delivery, from not only taking unstructured and moving it to structured, but taking unstructured conversations and summarizing it shorter. And so that it turns out that's likely to be a more complete value prop to our users.
And is that summary going to be kind of more towards the explainable AI to help them understand the structured data? Or are you using it to just facilitate the patient better understanding what happened during that call? Or how do you see using that summary?
Yeah, it's even the most basic sense that we as humans don't really do a good job of staring at a data set and making sense of it. And even it's nicely organized as a dashboard or some columns and tags in a UI, it's still pretty painful for us to go revisit a transaction or the framing of a transaction on a web page. And so the narrative story around what happened in a pithy 1, 3, 5 sentences, or possibly 2 paragraphs or 3 sentences, could end up going a long way to relieving cognitive burden of all these transactions that ultimately end up getting touched multiple times by multiple different provider stakeholders.
Yeah. That's how human brains work, right? We respond better and remember better and more quickly when we can assimilate a narrative as opposed to a block of structured data. Right. And this is why you'll find, QC processes in rev cycle call centers, for instance, where, the agent doesn't get credit for the call until they've entered a summarization into the claim data, so that as that information passes from agent to agent, as it goes through the cycle, it's very quick for them to kind of touch point and figure out where they are and where that claim is at. So
Wow.
I think it fits very nicely into that kind of human process workflow narrative.
That's interesting. I've thought about this a lot from the perspective of the clinical side, where all these wearable devices are sending mounds of data that can't be processed, right? But to hear it applied to the RCM is pretty fascinating. So I love it. Some really interesting perspectives.
I think that will happen in care management too, right?
Yeah.
So, this movement to have more touch points with more frequency in an omni-channel way is going to invariably involve kind of, narrative summaries to help these multiple touch points, where you're dealing with a patient or patient populations over longer periods of time.
Well, and that touch point might be a conversational agent that's asking the questions to just gather data at the edge, if you will.
100%.
Yeah. I mean, we started the company and we were projecting and kind of presenting that there's so much value we can do prior to the human-to-human conversation and after the human-to-human conversation, with the mindset that it would be many years into the future before we would be able to take on that one part of that conversation, whether it was another worker, a partner organization, or whether ultimately it was a patient.
Yeah.
Now we're beginning to have more confidence around being able to deliver a human-like and well-received virtual agent who will take on one part of that human conversation.
Yeah. Well, it's the only way we're going to scale to value-based care. That's my view. So appreciate you guys. This has been really insightful and really interesting, giving some real practical perspectives on what's happening rather than just the buzzwords we see at different conferences. So thanks so much, guys, and thanks everyone for watching and listening. If you want to find more great healthcare IT content like this, be sure to check it out at healthcareittoday.com or search for Healthcare IT Today on your favorite podcasting application. Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, Stead.
Thanks, John. Pleasure.